my contention is, when I was making it, it was like, you're making this film, and the idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice.
There is a Bible the Western world has never truly read, a Bible with 81 books, a Bible that never burned and never bowed. What happened during the 40 days after the resurrection? The New Testament answers in 8 verses. 8 verses for 40 days of appearances, teachings, conversations, corrections, and final instructions from a man who had just defeated death. 40 days where fear could become certainty, confusion could become clarity, and the disciples who doubted, scattered, and denied now faced proof. And yet almost nothing is recorded. So a question lingers after 2,000 years. If those days mattered, why are they nearly missing? If they were not written, were they meant to be, or quietly preserved elsewhere all along? The man who went looking. It began, as many revelations do, with a question. By 2004, Mel Gibson had already done what Hollywood said couldn't be done. He took a story everyone thought they understood, the crucifixion, and made it feel immediate, uncomfortable, and almost too real to sit through. The Passion of the Christ didn't just succeed, it shook people. It made over $600 million worldwide. It sparked debates in churches, in media, in academic circles. Some called it devotion. Others called it obsession. But almost everyone walked away with the same quiet realization. The story didn't feel finished, because the crucifixion was never the ending. The resurrection was. And what came after the resurrection? That's where things got vague. Gibson, who has always approached faith with intensity rather than distance, started asking the obvious question that somehow no one had really answered in detail. What happened next? Not the broad strokes or the Sunday sermon version, the specifics. What did Jesus say when he no longer had to speak in parables? What did he explain when doubt was no longer an option? What did those conversations sound like, in rooms where everyone present had just watched him die? Because if there was ever a moment for clarity, it was then. But the deeper Gibson looked into the Western canon, the more he ran into the same wall. Silence. So he did something that most filmmakers, and frankly, most believers, never think to do. He looked outside of it, because if the answers weren't preserved in the West, who else might have kept them? The Bible they never told you about. To understand what Gibson found, you have to reset what you think you know about Christianity's timeline. Because the version most people are familiar with, the Roman, European institutional version, is not the only version that survived, not even close. Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church traces its roots back to the 4th century, not as an offshoot, not as a late adopter, as an early, independent branch of Christianity that developed alongside, not under, Rome. While Europe was still arguing over doctrine, Ethiopia was already practicing it. While councils were debating which books belonged in the Bible, Ethiopian Christians were copying texts by hand, preserving traditions in a language and script the West didn't control. And here's where it gets interesting. The Protestant Bible contains 66 books. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The Ethiopian Bible, 81. Not as an expansion, not as an experiment, as a continuation. Included within it are texts the Western Church debated, questioned, and ultimately set aside. The Book of Enoch, Shepherd of Hermas, First Epistle of Clement. These weren't random additions. These were books that early Christians knew, quoted, argued about, and then, in the West, moved on from. But Ethiopia didn't. It kept them, protected them, treated them as part of the same continuous story. Which means one thing: if something was written about those missing 40 days, there is a better chance it survived in Ethiopia than anywhere else. So what exactly did those extra books say that made the West hesitate? And Ethiopia hold on? The Book of the Covenant. Among these texts is something far less famous, but far more provocative: Mashafa Kedan. In the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, the Mashafa Kedan is not a curiosity. It is not a footnote. It is canonical scripture, as authoritative as Matthew, as foundational as Genesis. And its subject matter is unlike anything in the Western New Testament. Scholars are careful about what they say next. The Mashafa Kedan is widely regarded as a medieval composition, a theological synthesis, assembled by Ethiopian scholars drawing on earlier oral and written traditions. It is not, in the academic consensus, a first-century eyewitness record. No early church father quotes it as a direct account of Jesus' post-resurrection words. But here is the thing about medieval theological synthesis. It doesn't appear from nothing. It is built from something, from traditions that were remembered, passed down, argued over, and eventually committed to parchment by people who believed they were preserving something real. And what the Mashafa Kedan preserves is a portrait of those 40 days that the Western Church never developed, a vision of what might have been spoken in the upper room when there was no longer any reason to speak in parables. It depicts a risen Christ addressing his disciples on the nature of divine light, a light the text presents not as metaphor, but as the very substance of creation. It speaks of spiritual forces that would corrupt the institutions built in his name. It describes a future church that would accumulate power and lose the thread of what it was supposed to be. Is this history? Is it prophecy? Is it the theological imagination of Ethiopian monks writing 5 centuries after the resurrection, trying to put words to something they felt had been left unsaid? Perhaps all three. And he spoke about the future of his own church. He warned, according to this text, that the institution built in his name would drift, that teachers would arise who prioritized power over truth, that councils would convene, and that in those councils things would be gained and things would be lost. What is remarkable is not that Ethiopia produced this text. What is remarkable is that the West produced nothing like it, and then forgot that the question was ever open. The 40 days are real. The gap is real. And the scattered, brief references the New Testament gives us for 40 days of post-resurrection activity represent one of the most quietly significant silences in the history of religion. Something happened in that room. The question is, why did the Western Church stop asking what it was? Why did one branch preserve them and another let them go? The men who found the hidden books. In 1773, a Scottish adventurer named James Bruce returned from Ethiopia carrying something that would shake the biblical scholarship of his age, a complete copy of the Book of Enoch. Enoch had been known to the early church. The Apostle Jude quoted it directly in the New Testament that survived. But the book itself had vanished from the Western canon, lost or removed. Bruce brought it back. Then came 1947. In the caves above the Dead Sea, a shepherd boy stumbled upon jars containing scrolls nearly 2,000 years old. Among them, fragments of Enoch. Not just any version, the Ethiopian version, word for word. It was confirmation that Ethiopia had not invented its scriptures. It had preserved them. While the West was building cathedrals and burning heretics and convening councils to decide what God was allowed to have said, Ethiopia was quietly copying, monk by monk, manuscript by manuscript, the most complete Christian library on earth. What else had been preserved that the West had forgotten? And if Ethiopia had been quietly safeguarding these texts for centuries, where exactly were they being kept? Debre, Damo, the monastery at the edge of the sky. If you want to see these texts in their native home, you have to earn it. Debre Damo Monastery sits atop a flat-topped mountain in the Debre region of northern Ethiopia, accessible by a single leather rope. No stairs, no road, no compromise. Women are not permitted. The outside world barely intrudes. Inside these walls, monks have copied scripture by hand for over 1,500 years. Generation after generation, in a script most of the world cannot read, preserving words that most of the world has never heard. This is not a museum. This is a living tradition. This is the church as it was before it became an empire. And it was in traditions like these, in the research, in the interviews, in the consultation with Ethiopian Orthodox theologians, that Gibson's creative search for the resurrection story found its footing. Because what the Ethiopian Bible offers a filmmaker is not just historical detail. It offers something rarer. It offers texture. It offers conversation. It offers the possibility that those 40 days were not empty, that they were full, perhaps the fullest days in human history, and that somewhere, carefully wrapped in oxhide and stored in the dark of an unreachable mountain, someone remembered. Because this isn't just about books. It's about access, knowledge that exists, but is physically out of reach, guarded not by secrecy, but by isolation and tradition. Which makes you wonder, if these texts have survived this long, untouched, what exactly do they say that made them worth protecting at all costs? The lie and who told it. In 325 AD, the Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. It was a turning point, but not the one most people imagine. Nicaea was primarily about doctrine, the nature of Christ, the dating of Easter, the structure of church authority. The biblical canon was not formally on the agenda. What followed Nicaea was slower, and in many ways more consequential. Over the next 2 centuries, through councils at Laodicea, Carthage, and eventually Trent in the 16th century, books were weighed, some were kept, others were set aside, not always because they were considered false, but because they were considered disputed, non-apostolic, or simply too difficult to control. The early church knew these texts. Scholars and bishops quoted them, argued over them, and in many cases simply moved on. The Book of Enoch was cited by church fathers and then quietly dropped. The Shepherd of Hermas was read aloud in services and then classified as outside the canon. These were not acts of malice. They were acts of institution building, the necessary, messy process of a young religion deciding what it was. But here is what that process produced. 2 traditions, reading different books, asking different questions, arriving at different understandings of the same faith. Ethiopia was not in those rooms. Ethiopia made no such agreements. Ethiopia owed Rome nothing. And so Ethiopia's canon developed independently, not as an act of resistance, but as an act of continuity. It preserved what it had always had. The result is not a conspiracy. It is something more interesting than a conspiracy. It is a divergence. 2 roads taken from the same origin point, leading to libraries that do not entirely resemble each other. And what is in the Ethiopian library that is not in yours? That is the question worth asking. What is undeniable is this. There are books of ancient Christian origin, books that were known and debated by early church fathers, books that appear in the oldest surviving Christian library on earth, and you have almost certainly never heard of them. That is not an accident, but it may not be a lie either. It may simply be what happens when history moves on without you. So no, this wasn't a clean conspiracy. It was something messier. It was something human. Debates, disagreements, decisions made in real time without knowing how history would judge them. But those decisions had consequences. Because once a canon is set, everything outside of it becomes invisible, not destroyed, not always suppressed, just ignored, and over time, forgotten. Which brings us back to the original gap, 40 days, 8 verses. So if those days weren't fully recorded in the texts we kept, what exactly fills the silence? What those 40 days contained? So what exactly does the Book of the Covenant say happened during those 40 days? Let us be honest about what we know and what we don't. The Mashafa Kedan is a complex text, theological, layered, demanding careful reading. But its themes are striking, and they rhyme with things that appear elsewhere in early Christian literature. The risen Christ in this text speaks about the nature of light as something living, not metaphor, but substance, a divine energy that preceded matter itself. He describes a cosmic architecture that sounds, to modern ears, almost scientific. Layers of creation, orders of spiritual beings, a universe far larger and stranger than the one his disciples had imagined. He warns about what he calls false shepherds, those who will speak his name and betray his meaning, those who will build structures of authority and mistake those structures for the kingdom itself. And he speaks about what comes next, not just the ascension, but what the ascension means. That his physical absence is not abandonment, that what he is leaving behind is not a void, but a presence, something he calls the Paraclete, the Comforter, but described in terms more intimate and more demanding than what the Western Gospels record. Whether these are the actual words of Jesus or the theological meditations of Ethiopian monks writing centuries later in his name, they are extraordinary. And they were almost entirely unknown to the West, until now. Because whether you see these writings as divine, interpretive, or somewhere in between, they attempt to answer a question the Western canon leaves open. They try to complete the conversation, and that alone makes them difficult to ignore, because silence invites interpretation, and interpretation creates possibilities. Which is exactly what makes this so compelling to someone like Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson has spoken publicly in interviews across 2023 and 2024 about his intention to make a sequel to The Passion of the Christ, a film focused on the resurrection. He has described it as the most important film he will ever attempt. He has spoken about angels, about the nature of what happened in that tomb, about wanting to render the inexplicable. For a filmmaker serious about authenticity, and Gibson, whatever else one might say about him, is ferociously serious about historical and theological authenticity. The 40 days represent the greatest creative challenge imaginable. 40 days, scattered across a handful of passages, a period the New Testament acknowledges but declines to fully illuminate. And in Ethiopia, in the Mashafa Kedan, in the oral traditions of monasteries older than Notre Dame, there is something to work with. There is texture, there is teaching, there is a story that someone, somewhere, took the care to write down. Because for Gibson, this isn't just about filling in narrative gaps. It's about confronting the part of the story that was never fully visualized, the part that exists somewhere between history, theology, and mystery. He's described the resurrection film as something far more abstract, more layered, less grounded in physical events, and more concerned with what those events meant. And that's where texts like the Mashafa Kedan become valuable, not as definitive answers, but as creative and theological frameworks. Because if those 40 days were as significant as the faith claims, then they weren't empty. They were dense, complicated, possibly overwhelming, which raises one final question. If the most important conversations in Christianity happened after the resurrection, are we only hearing a fraction of them? We want to be clear about something. This is not a simple story of suppression. History rarely is. The councils that shaped the Western canon were populated by sincere men wrestling with genuine complexity. The Ethiopian texts are not a secret gospel smuggled in defiance. They are the sacred inheritance of a church that simply chose differently. But sincerity is not the same as completeness. And the fact that 1 billion Christians today live with a 66-book Bible, while an ancient church on the African continent has been reading 81 books for 1,500 years, that is a fact worth sitting with. What happened during those 40 days? We may never know with certainty. Perhaps no document can tell us. Perhaps the distance between language and experience is simply too great. And whatever Jesus said in that upper room after the resurrection was always going to exceed the capacity of parchment and ink. But somewhere in the highlands of Ethiopia, in a monastery that can only be reached by rope, monks are still copying it down. Because they decided, 1,500 years ago and every day since, that it was worth remembering. Because history doesn't always erase things. Sometimes it just moves them, preserves them somewhere quieter, somewhere harder to reach. And whether you see the Ethiopian texts as scripture, tradition, or interpretation, they shift the perspective in a way that's hard to ignore. They remind you that Christianity didn't grow in one straight line. It didn't belong to one empire, one language, or one authority. It spread, branched and evolved in different directions at the same time. And somewhere along the way, different communities made different choices about what to preserve, what to emphasize, and what to leave behind. So maybe the story isn't about something being taken out. Maybe it's about something being held on to, protected, copied, passed down generation after generation by people who believed it still mattered. Because what survives history isn't always what was loudest. It's what someone, somewhere, refused to let disappear.